Good morning. This hearing will come to order. We are continuing at the Charleston County Council Chambers in North Charleston, South Carolina. I am Jason Neubauer of the United States Coast Guard, Deputy Chief of the Office of Investigations and Analysis, Washington, D.C. I'm the chair of the Coast Guard's Marine Board investigation and the presiding officer over these proceedings. The Commandant of the Coast Guard has convened this board under the authority of Title 46, United States Code, Section 6301, and Title 46, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 4, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the implosion of the Titan, with the loss of 5 lives on June 18, 2023, while conducting deep-sea operations in the vicinity of the RMS Titanic wreck site. I have previously determined that OceanGate Incorporated is a party in interest to this investigation. OceanGate is represented by law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. As a designated party in interest, OceanGate has a statutory right to employ counsel to represent them, to cross-examine witnesses, and to have witnesses called on their behalf. I will examine all witnesses at this formal hearing under oath or affirmation, and witnesses will be subject to federal laws and penalties governing false official statements. Witnesses who are not parties in interest may be advised by their counsel concerning their rights. However, such counsel may not examine or cross-examine other witnesses or otherwise participate in these proceedings. These proceedings are open to the public and to the media. I ask for the cooperation of all persons present to minimize any disruptive influence on the proceedings in general and on the witnesses in particular. An area has been set aside for news media use during the proceedings. The media may question witnesses concerning the testimony that they have given after I've released them from these proceedings. I ask that such interviews be conducted outside of this courtroom. Since the date of the casualty, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and Coast Guard have conducted substantial evidence collection activities, and some of that previously collected evidence will be considered during these hearings. Should any person have or believe they have information not brought forward but which might be of direct significance, that person is urged to bring that information to my attention by emailing titan@uscg.mil. The NTSB has provided a representative for this hearing. Mr. Marcel Muse, seated to my far right, is the investigator in charge for the NTSB investigation. Mr. Muse, would you like to make a statement for the record?
Good morning, Chair. My only update today is the NTSB will release 3 factual reports related to this accident. They will be on our website, if not already. They're related to 2 on material science and 1 on meteorology. There'll be a follow-up direct link on our Twitter feed at NTSB_newsroom at the top of the hour.
Thank you, sir. Our first witness of the day will be Dr. Don Kramer, a senior materials engineer with the NTSB. Dr. Kramer, the board's recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will now administer your oath.
Good morning. Could you please raise and stand and raise your right hand? A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated, Doctor.
Dr. Kramer, thanks for making the trip down from D.C. Lieutenant Commander Williams is going to start with your questioning, sir.
Good morning, Dr. Kramer. First, I'd like to thank you for being here with us today. We understand that you have a presentation to give, but prior to that presentation, I have a few background questions for you. Can you please describe your educational background?
Yes, so I have a bachelor's in metallurgical engineering from the University of Illinois, which I received in 1994. And I have a PhD in material science and engineering from the University of Minnesota, which I received in 2000.
Can you briefly describe your work history?
Yes, so after receiving my degrees, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology from about 2000 to about 2002. I then was a postdoc at Northwestern University until about 2005. From there, I worked at a medical device company from 2005 to about 2008. And in 2008, I joined NTSB.
What are your past and current duties with respect to working at the National Transportation Safety Board?
So as a materials engineer at NTSB, I'm in charge of or tasked with investigating mechanical failures of materials in transportation accidents. NTSB is a multimodal organization, and I am part of the Office of Research and Engineering, which supports all the modes. So we participate in accidents in aviation, highway, pipeline, rail, as well as marine.
Thank you. And what is your current position at NTSB?
My current position is the acting chief of the materials laboratory.
Thank you. Lieutenant Steele, could you please bring up Dr. Kramer's presentation? Dr. Kramer, I would like to invite you to present your material.
All right. Good morning. This work was performed at the request of and in collaboration with the Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation. I would like to thank the Coast Guard for the opportunity to participate in this investigation. Before beginning my presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the assistance and feedback from my colleagues at the NTSB, as well as these listed organizations. Today I'm going to present some results of the materials group investigation into the implosion of the OceanGate submersible Titan. After some nomenclature, the presentation will be broadly divided into two parts. In the first part, I will describe what we have learned about the construction of the Titan's composite hull and the implementation of its real-time monitoring system. I'll briefly discuss the version 1 hull. I will then move on to the second, or V2 hull. This hull was manufactured using a multi-step co-bonding process that was different than the V1 hull in that it contains multiple adhesive bonded joints. We were able to examine some material from the manufacturing of the V2 hull, and we found several anomalies within the composite and the adhesive joints, including waviness, wrinkles, porosity, and voids. I'll show examples of those as well as some features consistent with rubbing damage at one of those adhesive joints. Next, I'll recap the Titan's real-time monitoring system. I'll talk briefly about the principles behind these methods and review how OceanGate implemented them on Titan. The second part of my presentation will focus on changes in the mechanical response of the hull following dive 80 and observations gathered from images of the wreckage on the ocean floor. I'll show that the Titan's real-time monitoring system detected the loud bang that we've heard about previously, and that the strain response of the hull changed on subsequent dives after the bang. I'll finish with some images from the Titan wreckage. These will show that the composite hull experienced substantial delaminations at or adjacent to two of the hull's co-bonded joints. Before continuing, I do need to note that the NTSB's own investigation into the Titan mishap is still ongoing, and as such, the scope of my testimony will be limited to factual information. Also, there is a significant amount of additional documentation that can be found in the NTSB reports. I'll begin with some basic nomenclature. So the first term to define is composite. A composite in general is any material made up of more than one material, but as applied to Titan, it'll refer to unidirectional carbon fibers that are embedded in and reinforced by a hardened polymer matrix. OceanGate utilized several methods of fabricating composite structures from unidirectional fiber. One was wet winding. For this method, the fiber starts out dry and is dipped into a liquid resin bath by the user at the point of use. The other is pre-preg. In pre-preg systems, the carbon fiber is pre-impregnated with resin by the fiber manufacturer, or often by the fiber manufacturer, and is often delivered as a flat sheet on a roll. It can then be split into tapes or tows. Here's an example of a pre-preg splitting operation. This is a comparatively small machine and would probably not have been sufficient for the amount of fiber that OceanGate needed for Titan, but it illustrates the idea of splitting. A rolled up sheet of prepreg is loaded into the machine and is sent through a series of cutters, producing a large number of tapes or toes. The toes are then rewound onto individual spools. One of these individual toes could contain thousands or even tens of thousands of individual carbon fibers, depending on its width and thickness. The prepreg tapes that we saw in the previous slide are clearly very thin, so objects built up using layers and layers of these tapes will have a laminated structure. One course or level of unidirectional material is a ply or lamina. I'll now discuss the manufacturing of Titan's composite hull. The Titan V1 cylindrical composite hull was manufactured in 2017 and was at the core of the Titan pressure vessel. The hull was manufactured using a combination of wet wound fiber for the circumferential plies and prepreg for the longitudinal plies. The ends of the cylindrical hull were capped by titanium rings called segments that were glued to each end. The segments in turn were mated to cylindrical titanium domes that were bolted on at either end, and the forward dome contained no affordance for the viewport. As previously noted, a crack was discovered in the composite hull and it was retired from service in 2019. Oh, too loud. Okay, all right. Investigators had the opportunity to examine a leftover piece of the Titan V1 hull. The hull was originally manufactured with excess material at both ends, and then the hull was trimmed to size. The leftover piece was trimmed excess material from one of those ends. The piece contained voids and delaminations. One notable delamination was located about mid-thickness and is shown from different directions in these two images as indicated by the white arrows. After OceanGate retired the V1 hull, they manufactured two 1/3 scale test articles. Just like the Titan V1 hull, those cylinders were manufactured with extra material on both ends, and then the cylinder was trimmed to size. One of those trimmed end pieces is shown in this image, and in greater detail in these images. Yeah, thank you. The trimmed end piece contained two notable wrinkles and a mid-thickness delamination as indicated by the arrow in the upper image. According to multiple former directors of engineering for OceanGate, both subscale test articles imploded or were on the verge of imploding at or below 2,800 meters. OceanGate identified these wrinkles as a likely cause of the low implosion pressure. In order to mitigate the wrinkle problem, OceanGate pursued a co-bonding process, which I'll describe in a couple of slides. After building a couple of test rings to test the viability of the co-bonding process, OceanGate proceeded with building a full-scale version 2 hull for Titan. The full-scale V2 hull was manufactured by automatic fiber placement. This is a robotic system that, in this case, was probably attached to an overhead rail and trolley system and contained multiple spools of prepreg tape loaded into a fiber placement head. The head can apply multiple tapes in multiple directions. For the first two plies, the tapes were applied in the circumferential direction, like a spiral from one end of the hull to the other. For the third ply, the tapes were applied in the longitudinal direction. The sequence was then repeated until 133 plies, approximately 1 inch of prepreg material, had been applied to the hull. The hull then proceeded to curing and co-bonding. The co-bonding process, or multi-cure process, as it was sometimes referred to by OceanGate, involved building up the composite hull in 1-inch layer increments. After the first inch of prepreg was applied, the layer was capped by a peel ply. This peel ply was a plain woven synthetic fabric that was designed to be removed later. The assembly was then cured at elevated temperature and pressure in an autoclave. After curing, the peel ply was stripped from the surface. The act of stripping the peel ply is intended to create an active surface for adhesive bonding. After peel ply removal, bulges in the hull were removed by grinding. A layer of film adhesive was applied, followed by another inch of prepreg, capped once again by a peel ply. The assembly was once again sent to the autoclave for curing. This process was repeated until a nominally 5-inch thick hull was produced. The image on the right shows a cross-section through a trimmed end piece of the hull. The lighter lines spaced about an inch apart are the layers of film adhesive used to join the carbon fiber composite layers. This image shows the rough V2 hull upon completion. The rough hull was manufactured with excess material at either end, which was subsequently trimmed off. The materials group examined trimmed end pieces and a recovered piece of the V2 hull and found waviness, wrinkles, and porosity within the composite layers and voids within the adhesive that joined the layers. The Titan hull exhibited waviness and wrinkles within the hull layers, especially the 2nd through the 5th layers. The image on the left is an overview image of one of the trimmed ends. The image on the right shows a portion of the through thickness face under oblique lighting. The oblique lighting reflects off of the composite plies based on their orientation. The periodic light-dark reflections are an indication of the waviness of the layered structure. We examined the trimmed end in closer detail and found instances where wrinkles had been ground flush with the outer surface prior to the building of the next layer. The image on the left shows an example of wrinkle grinding. A thorough examination of one of the trimmed ends indicated that the number of ground wrinkles increased with each successive layer, peaking at 24 for the 4th layer. No grinding was performed on layer 5 as it was the last layer. It should be noted that the number of plies removed by grinding varied significantly. In a survey on a block of material brought back to the lab, the number of plies removed by grinding varied from 1 to 12. We also observed porosity between composite plies. This is an image of a single layer piece of the hull that was retrieved from the ocean floor. The side that is shown is the adhesive used to join 2 layers. The other side is painted, indicating that it is the innermost layer, or layer 1. The strip has been cut out to evaluate the through thickness material structure. Here's a macro scale image of the cut piece. The next slide is at higher magnification and shows the composite plies in greater detail. The higher magnification images reveal the laminate structure of the hull. The lighter gray layers are circumferential plies, where the fibers lie within the slide, and the darker gray layers are longitudinal plies, where the fibers run in and out of the slide. In between the plies, there were thin layers of resin that contained porosity. A higher magnification image on the right of the slide illustrates this point. Several examples of pores within this fine resin layer are indicated by the red ovals. The amount of porosity within these resin layers was estimated to be between 18 and 27%. Finally, investigators observed voids in the adhesive used to join the co-bonded layers. Some voids were present in all layers. However, at the interface between the 1st and 2nd layers and between the 3rd and 4th layers, some of the voids formed elongated structures in the adhesive. These structures were visible on longitudinal cross-sections like the one shown. The appearance and structure of the voids within the adhesive bond is illustrated by this laboratory fracture. A thin strip of hull material at the layer 1 and layer 2 adhesive joint was snapped open, and the resulting fracture surface is shown in the lower image. 3 distinct regions were seen on the fracture surface. The green regions are fractured adhesive. The vertical linear features are fractures through the carbon fiber composite. The checkerboard-like regions are thin layers of hardened epoxy that are above the carbon fiber composite but beneath the adhesive. The checkerboard patterns were left behind by the peel ply that was used during the curing process and then subsequently removed. The areas where you see this pattern were associated with the voids. Examination of the retrieved single-layer hull piece also revealed features that were consistent with rubbing damage on the adhesive surface. Voids were observed on the surface of the piece, like those observed on the trimmed end. As shown in the images above, some of these voids contained cream-colored debris that was readily removed with the tip of a fine blade and a synthetic bristle brush. The debris was collected and its chemical spectrum was analyzed along with a sample of the green film adhesive. As seen in this image, the debris and the adhesive had similar spectral peak positions and relative peak intensities. There were also physical characteristics consistent with rubbing. As shown in the image and indicated by the red arrows, the adhesive exhibited rubbing marks that were oriented in the longitudinal direction. Next, I'll discuss the components of Titan's real-time monitoring system. This system comprised two sensor types. The first type, of course, was acoustic event detection, and the second was the monitoring of mechanical strain or deformation. I'll start by discussing the acoustic monitoring system. The Titan's acoustic monitoring system functioned on the principle that fractures and other forms of material damage create sound waves. These sound waves can be detected using acoustic sensors. These sensors are just tiny microphones that can be affixed to a surface and trained to listen for sounds associated with breakdown of the material. This is a complex but established field of engineering. The Titan's acoustic monitoring system comprised 8 sensors, with 7 attached to the inner surface of the hull and 1 attached to the inner surface of the aft titanium segment. On the hull, 2 were located at the forward end, 3 were in the middle, and 2 were at the aft end. The system listened for acoustic events that exceeded a predetermined amplitude, and when it detected one, it counted it as a hit and added it to a running tally of the total number of hits. There were 2 thresholds for the number of hits. The first threshold issued a yellow alert, and the second issued a red warning, at which point the dive was to be aborted. The amplitude and quantity of hits were established based on acoustic activity from the retired V1 hull and the subscale test articles. Investigators examined acoustic emission data from dives in 2022, and when the data was analyzed, it was noted that 3 of the 8 sensors did not appear to detect acoustic events. One of those sensors was located at the forward end of the hull on the starboard side, and 2 were in the middle, as indicated by the red circles on the illustration. This slide illustrates the difference in sensor response. The slide shows 2 plots side by side of the forward acoustic emission sensors from dive number 76, which took place on July 6th of 2022. These are the original plots produced by OceanGate. Elapsed time is shown on the horizontal axis, and acoustic event amplitude and dive depth are shown on the vertical axis. The left plot shows captured acoustic events at the forward port side sensor, while the right plot shows acoustic events captured by the forward starboard side sensor. The latter sensor did not appear to register any significant events. Next, I'll discuss the strain monitoring system. Titan monitored hull strain using readily available metal foil strain gauges. As these gauges stretch or compress, the resistance of the metal foil changes, and hooking the gauges into a circuit and measuring the voltage drop across the gauge terminals enables the measurement of strain. The gauges were grouped into right angle pairs as illustrated on the right. There were 8 strain gauge pairs on Titan. 5 gauge pairs were located on the hull, and 1 pair was located on the aft segment. 2 gauge pairs were originally located on the forward dome during testing at the Deep Ocean Test Facility and may have been moved to other locations on the hull. As illustrated by the red arrows on the image, 1 gauge in the pair was aligned in the circumferential direction and measured hoop strain. The other gauge was aligned along the axis of the cylinder and measured longitudinal strain. All right. On July 15th, 2022, Titan executed a dive to the Titanic. entered into the dive log as dive 80. Upon returning to the surface, the crew heard a loud bang, which was documented by the pilot in the OceanGate dive log and has been discussed at this hearing. This was the 14th dive to a notable depth for Titan V2 since initial deployment and the 6th notable dive of the 2022 expedition. The real-time monitoring system captured this loud bang, and it also captured changes in the hull's strain response after the bang. The audible event was captured as indicated by the acoustic activity plot on the left. The sensor shown here was located at the forward port side of the hull. The horizontal axis displays time, and the vertical axis, again, displays both acoustic event amplitude and dive depth. The acoustic activity increased upon returning to the surface leading up to the event, which is indicated by the red arrow. Several strain gauges also responded to this event. The graph on the left shows the hoop and longitudinal strain responses during the dive for Group 4. As Titan descended, the gauge outputs increased in response to the external pressure as expected, and during the ascent, the output decreased as expected. Shortly after returning to the surface, the hoop and longitudinal gauges both showed a sudden shift in gauge output as indicated by the red arrow.
Lieutenant Steele, could we go back and try to get back on that page? It looks like it's not loading.
Okay, well, we'll just have to proceed, unfortunately. And so this is also presented in the materials lab factual reports. So if need be, interested in individuals can refer to the factual report. When plotted together, one can see that the sudden change in strain gauge readout coincides with the large acoustic event.
Dr. Kramer,
Yeah.
I think this is important. Why don't we take a 5-minute recess to see if we can get that slide to, show to function? Is there stages on that slide that should be loading?
It essentially shows both the, for whatever reason, it's not plotting correctly. It shows an overlay of the acoustic emission and the strain response for the, 30-minute interval after it surfaces. But it's,
I'll get it for you.
Sorry, yeah, let's just take a 5-minute just recess. I think we can get that slide
right.
working, sir.
okay.
We will reconvene at 9:18.
All right, thank you. So, so referring to slide 40, when plotted together, one can see that the sudden change in strain gauge readout coincides with the large acoustic event. Some of the gauges showed a change in strain response after dive 80. OceanGate strain data was typically, and perhaps always, plotted as a function of time. The changes in mechanical response are easier to visualize by plotting the strain against dive depth, as shown here for the hoop strain at gauge group 4. Plotting the data in this manner is more akin to a stress strain plot, which is a standard way of visualizing this type of data. For dive 80, prior to the event, the relationship between strain and dive depth was a straight line for both the descent and the ascent. Going backwards in time by 3 dives and comparing dive 80 to an earlier dive 75 reveals no significant change from dive to dive. Moving forward in time and looking at dive 81, the dive immediately after the event, we see a change in the initial strain response of the hull. The next slide focuses on the initial and final 1,000 meters of the dive. The graph on the left shows the hoop strain, and the graph on the right shows the longitudinal strain. Changes in the initial strain response are seen in both directions. Furthermore, the changes persist from dive 81 through dive 83, which is the last dive for which we have strain data. Yeah, you can swap back over now. So next slide.
It's coming up.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So changes in strain response after dive 80 were also seen for the longitudinal strain for gauge group 5 and to a lesser extent for the hoop strain at gauge group 8. Those changes also persisted for dives 82 and 83. There were no apparent changes for groups 3 or 7. Oh,
Might not be able to do.
perhaps we should switch over to the PDF version.
Agreed. Lieutenant Steele, let's just stick with
Yeah.
the PDF.
Next slide. Sure I get my bearings right here. So the acoustic emission response at the forward port side sensor showed a slight initial increase after dive 80 and a fall off afterwards. Here we see the response for dive 80 and its spike in acoustic activity after returning to the surface. Looking at dive 81, there was an increase in acoustic activity during the descent and once again an increase in activity after returning to the surface. Dives 82 and 83 show a trend of the hull becoming quieter with successive dives as seen here for dive 82. Next slide. And here for dive 83. One note about dive 83, this dive did not take place at the Titanic wreck site and did not go to the same depth as the other dives. According to the dive log, it reached a depth of 2,954 meters. This is the last dive for which acoustic emission and strain data is available. For the final part of my presentation, I'll go over some images of the Titan wreckage where we will see that the hull encountered a significant amount of delamination, the majority of it within or adjacent to co-bonded adhesive interfaces. This image shows the Titan wreckage as it was discovered on the ocean floor. The aft dome, aft segment, top rail, side rails, and the aft portion of the composite hull were located together. The forward dome, shown to the right, the forward segment, and the tail section were each found by themselves. Much of the forward hull had fragmented into multiple pieces spread around the ocean floor. One segment of the hull, near the top of the vessel, though, was intact nearly along its entire length. and also stayed with the main wreckage. This is an image of the single layer piece that was recovered and examined at the laboratory. This piece was located approximately 350 feet from the main wreckage and had a piece of lead wedged in a crevice. Here's another view of the main wreckage. From this view, two notable pieces of the wreckage are visible and indicated. One is the piece that extends nearly the entire length of the hull near the top, and the other is a piece on the port side as indicated by the white outlines. This image shows these two pieces laying flat on the ocean floor during a recovery mission. Both pieces, and in fact much of the hull, had delaminated into multiple shells or layers. A cross-section image on the right illustrates where these delaminations occurred. The first shell consisted solely of layer 1. The second shell consisted of layers 2 and 3, and finally the outermost shell consisted of layers 4 and 5. The delamination between the innermost shell and the middle shell, could you please go back, actually? To this side. I'll go ahead and give you a cue for next slide when I'm ready. Okay. No, I kind of lost where. So the sorry, I lost where I was. So the delamination between the innermost shell and the middle shell occurred within the adhesive at the layer 1, layer 2 interface for all the pieces that could be examined. This was seen earlier on the single layer piece at the forward end of the hull, and it can be seen here for the layer that's labeled 1 at the lower right of the image. Another layer 1 piece is hidden on this image but is visible on the next slide. It too shows separation within the adhesive. The delamination between the middle shell and the outer shell shows a more complex separation pattern. For the piece that was located on the port side, shown on the left, we can see the green adhesive at the top of layer 3, consistent with separation within the adhesive. Next, okay, good. Looking at this same piece, with the outer shell removed, we see that toward the aft end, there's a mixed region where some of the separation took place within the adhesive and some within the adjoining composite layer. At the forward end, there's also a square patch of composite material still attached to the surface. Okay. Also of note for this piece, the outer shell consisting of layers 4 and 5 was fractured through the layers, and a chunk of it was missing, which is why the top surface of layer 3 is visible. These through thickness fractures were not found in the middle shell. Turning our attention back to the long piece from the top of the vessel at the right of the image, the separation between the middle shell and the outer shell appeared to occur primarily through the carbon fiber composite or along the interface with the adhesive. This can be seen for the piece labeled 2 and 3 on the right of the image. The dark color is consistent with fracture of the composite. The outer shell consisting of layers 4 and 5 is labeled in the background at the top of this image and is highlighted on the next slide. From this point of view, the green adhesive at the bonded joint can be seen on the inside of the 4th layer. Delamination features were also observed on other pieces of the hull. Images and descriptions of those pieces are contained within the NTSB factual reports. So to summarize, the Titan V2 hull was manufactured from pre-preg unidirectional carbon fiber using a co-bonding process with multiple adhesive interfaces. Examination of the hull material revealed waviness, wrinkles, porosity, and voids within the multi-layered structure. A recovered piece of the hull exhibited features consistent with rubbing. Examination of strain gauge data after dive 80 event showed a change in the mechanical response of the hull for 4 strain gauges across 3 locations of the hull. Those changes persisted from dive to dive. As just described, the composite hull showed significant delamination into 3 shells, a shell comprising layer 1, a shell comprising layers 2 and 3, and a shell comprising layers 4 and 5. This brings me to the end of my prepared testimony. I would like to thank the Coast Guard for the opportunity to present these findings and would be happy to answer questions at this time.
Dr. Kramer, thank you for that thorough presentation and all of the forensics working up to that. We appreciate your time and also collaboration with the other substantially interested states to the investigation and the Coast Guard. Lieutenant Commander Williams has questions for you, sir.
Dr. Kramer, can you explain to me how a wrinkle would form in carbon fiber?
So the way that the wrinkle likely formed for OceanGate was during what would be called a debulk, or from vacuum bagging part of the procedure. To consolidate the layer, they would wrap the entire assembly in a impermeable bag and then apply a vacuum. This is to try to remove the excess voids or excess open volume. That causes a compression or consolidation of the material against the mandrel or the form.
As you noted, the second hull, or V2, was cured after each 1-inch layer in an autoclave. Can you explain to us what an autoclave is and its purpose?
Sure. So an autoclave is an oven where you can increase the atmospheric pressure. And so the purpose of increasing the atmospheric pressure is to increase the external force on the composite as it is curing, so that you can remove as much voids and porosity as possible and consolidate the material as best as you can.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the diagrams that you have outlined on slide 33. Lieutenant Steele, could you bring up slide 33?
Is this it?
This slide is the location of the acoustic emission sensors. As you noted, the blue sensors means that the sensor was working, and the red means that there was no acoustic activity detected. As we know, Channel 2, Channel 4, and Channel 7 all had full-scale acoustic emissions. You should have a laser pointer in front of you. Can you show me on your diagram where those sensors were located? I'm sorry, I don't think it's in front of you. We have to go grab the laser pointer for you.
Don't think I have the laser pointer. While we're waiting, can you repeat the question? I started looking around for my laser pointer.
I was going to ask you if you could show me on the diagram where sensors for channels 2, 4, and 7 are.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, so channel 2 would be right there. So that is the at the forward end of the hull on the port side. Channel 4 would be in the middle of the hull at the top. And, sorry, can you remind me again, what was the?
In channel 7?
Channel 7. I believe this is channel 7. I believe channel 7 is also on the top of the hull at the aft end.
We also noted from the real-time monitoring data that channel 6 and channel 8 had acoustic admissions, but they were not full scale. Can you show me where channel 6 and channel 8 are located on the diagram?
So channel 6 would be on the aft titanium segment or ring, and channel 8 would be right here on the lower port side at the aft end of the hull.
Earlier, we had discussed that the acoustic emission sensors 1, 3, and 5 had little to no activity. I wanted to confirm that AE sensors 1, 3, and 5 are the ones shown in red on your diagram.
That is correct. Oh, sorry.
In your presentation, you noted that there was dust present in the peel ply impression between layers 1 and 2, which is slides 26 and 27 of your presentation. I wanted to confirm that the test that you conducted showed that the dust was consistent with being the same material as that of the adhesive layer.
What slide was that?
Slides 26 and 27.
Okay, so this, I think, at this point, the only way that I can really respond to that is when we examine the debris and a piece of the adhesive using a Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy system, they produce these spectra that have similar peak positions and similar peak intensities. And the wave number positions and the intensities are indications of the types of molecular structures that are present in the sample. And I think at this point, that's about all I can say to that.
Thank you. Did you conduct material testing on the cut-off ends of the carbon fiber hull?
So we did conduct some material testing of material. We conducted one type of test. Well, actually, okay, go ahead with your question.
To confirm, the cut-off ends, those were from the second hull, correct?
That's correct.
And what material tests did you conduct on the cut-off ends of that second hull?
Okay, so on the cutoff end, the test that we conducted on the cutoff end was a through thickness shear type test. We also conducted some material testing on the recovered hull piece, and that was a longitudinal compression test of the carbon fiber, and we also submitted a sample for porosity measurement as well. But those two samples were from the recovered piece.
And to confirm the results of those, are those in the documentation that will be provided?
That's correct.
Okay. What was the overall thickness of the carbon fiber for that second hull?
The overall thickness of the hull was what was measured on the trimmed ends, and the two trim ends measured, I believe it was like 5.16 and 5.17 inches.
What could cause the overall thickness to exceed 5 inches? More specifically, could porosity be the cause of producing an overall thickness that exceeds 5 inches?
Well, I think the best way that I can answer that question is to note that the material in question does have some data available for it as far as what the expected porosity content is, and the expectation is that the porosity content should be in the vicinity of 0.4 to 0.5%. The material spec sheet for the same material calls out a cured ply thickness value of 7.5 thousandths of an inch. So 20 of those plies should have, on average, a thickness of about 0.15 inches. And 133 of them should have a stack height of about 0.997 inches. So when we measured the thickness of the layers, they were consistently above that value. They were about 1.02 to 1.03 inches. When we sent samples out for porosity measurement, we came back with values that on average were about 2.2% for porosity. And when we looked at the structure of the composite, we noted that at the base of the layer, there was no visual indication of porosity, but when we looked towards the top of the layer, as we showed in the image, there was an indication of porosity. And so, obviously, porosity is open volume, and so that is certainly something to be considered.
The dive depth strain curves that you presented, I wanted to confirm that you developed those curves, and this was not something that you received from OceanGate.
That is correct.
Speaking specifically about what you found, after dive 80, were you able to tell the difference between the strain curves when you looked at the strain curves developed by OceanGate? Or more specifically, was there an obvious deviation between the strain curves developed by OceanGate, or was the only way you noticed the nonlinear response of the strain at shallow depths was by graphing this information in a different way?
So, Lieutenant Steele, could you bring up slide 65? So this slide here shows the hoop and longitudinal strain gauge output for Group 4, for dive 80, and for dive 81. The graph on the left is the original OceanGate data as I received it. I did go ahead and replot it for dive 81 because as Mr. Brooks testified, occasionally their plotting software would produce strange outputs on occasion, and so it was very difficult to do a side-by-side comparison. But this is the type of data that, as far as we know, OceanGate was producing, and so these would have been the plots that they would have been evaluating. And so I guess it's a matter of opinion as to whether one can discern the changes in strain output from these graphs.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.
Dr. Kramer, Lieutenant Commander Whalen has a question.
Thank you, Dr. Kramer. When you measured, and we had just discussed measuring the thickness of the version 2 hull, and the number was approximately 5. What was it? 5 point?
It's somewhere between 5/32 and 3/16 above the 5-inch, the nominal 5-inch thickness. Yeah.
Did you do the same tests on the version 1 hull? Or the same measurement, I should say?
I did do a thickness measurement on the version 1 hull.
And what was that?
It was like 4.97. It was slightly below 5 inches. Lieutenant Steele, can you? I do have a slide where I have a visual comparison of those two. You can bring that up. That's slide 63. Yeah. So This slide here shows a piece of the version 1 and a piece of the version 2 trimmed ends stacked on top of one another. So you can, I think, visually see the difference in the thickness of the two hulls.
And that would have been the area of the carbon fiber, not specific to these two as they're trimmed ends, but the width of the carbon fiber as visualed in this is the same as would be on the trimmed off end, which went into the clevis of the titanium ring.
That is correct. And in fact, we did have a chance to examine the outermost shell, the layer 4 and 5 of that very long piece. And we were able to see that the outside of that layer had material removed from it to presumably to bring the thickness down to the level where it could be inserted into the titanium ring.
And they were the same titanium rings that were used on version 1 and version 2?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
That's all the questions I have, sir. Thank you.
Lieutenant Steele, can you bring up slide 34, please? Dr. Kramer, I'm going back to the acoustic emission data from Dive 76. And this question comes down to, I'm trying to figure out if the acoustic sensors were inoperable or just maybe hearing less noise prior to the Dive 80. And we had previous testimony that this could, the lesser acoustics could be due to a scaling issue from the different graphs. And that's what I want to ask you, sir. Looking at this, is the potential for channel 1 to be a scaling issue? Are these the same scales?
Well, so these two graphs, these two plots are the same scale.
So in your opinion, is it likely that the other acoustic sensor is either highly degraded or inoperable?
I don't think that I'm in a position to answer that question. I'm sorry.
For Dive 80, did you see any indications of a acoustic reading on on channel 1 for the loud bang?
I think it's fair to say that for any dive that we examined in 2022, on the plots, we didn't see any, on channels 1, 3, and 5, we did not see any indications of notable acoustic events. There were, as you see on this slide here, the right graph, the forward starboard sensor, there are occasional blips, like if you look, well, yeah. So there are occasional blips like the one that you see, but in general, they do not show the same type of acoustic characteristic that the other sensors show.
And sir, now I'd like to talk about the sanding to fair the hull after each 1-inch layer was applied. Do you know if that sanding was done on carbon fiber layers that were longitudinal or cross-sectional?
Well, so for any sanding event that went 3 layers down or more, it would have sanded into both circumferential layers and longitudinal layers, because the repeating sequence, the repeating stack is 2 plies in the circumferential direction, 1 in the longitudinal direction, and that sequence is repeated, until the desired thickness is achieved. So if it's a single layer that's been sanded into, it would actually depend on which interface it is, because it actually changes from interface to interface what the orientation of the topmost ply is.
And was there a consistent topmost ply?
No, because the number of plies was 133, and since that's not evenly divisible by 3, it sort of cycles through the possible top layers, essentially.
Understand. And sir, if I remember right, you said the deepest sanding you saw was 13 plies?
We brought back a block of one of the trimmed end pieces, and on that particular block, I think the largest count that we had was 12.
So that would essentially be 6 layers, 6 different plies.
It's 12 plies, so it's almost 12 plies out of 133. So you're approaching 10% of the layer.
In your professional opinion or experience, would that reduce any of the strength of the overall layer?
Well, I think that would require some analysis in order to quantify that. I think there is some literature to suggest that there is some leeway in fiber orientation, but it requires, I think it requires detailed analysis in order to determine the severity of it. Yeah.
Understand. Thank you, sir. At this time, I'd like to go to the NTSB for any questions.
Good morning, Dr. Kramer. And I just have one follow-up. Do we know how the uncured light green adhesive was applied?
So we're talking about the adhesive that is used to join the layers?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that is provided as a sheet or a film, and so that's essentially how it's applied. It comes as a big sheet, and then it's just draped over the hull.
Thank you, Dr. Kramer.
Yep.
At this time, I'd like to go to OceanGate for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer, for your time today, and thank you for your analysis. Is it correct that the issues you just discussed in your presentation do not relate to the viewport that was used on the Titan at the time of the implosion?
So I did not discuss the viewport in my presentation.
Thank you. We have heard testimony of a theory that the glue joint between the carbon fiber hull and the titanium rings may have been a potential point of failure. Was the review of that theory within the scope of the analysis that you performed?
So we did have an opportunity to examine the titanium rings and the adhesive and whatever remnants of adhesive were on those rings, and that information is documented in the factual reports.
Thank you. You testified to the delaminations, voids, and rubbing damage and debris fragments that you observed. Could you explain how you determine which of these issues were present before the incident as opposed to being caused by the implosion?
Well, so I don't think that I have stated anything about the timing of these observations, and so I'm not offering any analysis at this point as to whether they occurred before or after the implosion.
Okay. And similarly, I'm assuming that you also didn't determine in your analysis, haven't determined whether these issues you've observed could be the cause of the implosion.
Yeah, that is still subject to our own internal analysis at this point.
Got it. So we have heard testimony that the voids near the ends of the carbon fiber are expected due to the winding process, which is why the ends are trimmed off. Was this considered during your analysis?
I am aware of that, and that is something that will be taken into consideration.
Thank you. That's it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kramer. We're done with our questions.
At this time, I'd like to take a 10-minute recess just to make sure there's no final questions for you, sir. And we'll reconvene at 10:05.
Okay.
Thank you. This hearing is now back in order. Dr. Kramer, Lieutenant Commander Williams has some follow-up questions, sir.
Dr. Kramer, I just have 2 follow-up questions. We heard testimony earlier during this hearing that using cutoff ends of the hull to produce witness panels to conduct mechanical testing of carbon fiber is a standard used in industry. Would the cutoff ends of the hull that you analyzed be representative of this to be used to conduct mechanical testing?
Can you maybe rephrase your question? I feel like you're asking me to offer an opinion as to whether this material would be, well, anyway, go ahead.
To restate the question or to rephrase the question, the cutoff ends that you analyzed, is that consistent with what would be used to make witness panels?
Well, so I have to claim a little bit of ignorance here. I was not actually present for that particular presentation. So, but I would say that I think that if an organization wanted to do a witness panel, that would be something that would have been planned for and would have been part of the manufacturing process.
My next question is to confirm the cutoff ends of the hull that you analyzed were not found as part of the debris of the Titan.
That's correct.
They were excess material from the winding of the hull.
That is correct.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you. And for the record, I want to state that the cutoff end caps were maintained and provided by OceanGate from their Everett facility.
Just to clarify, you mean the trimmed ends?
The trimmed ends,
Yeah,
yes.
of the carbon fiber, not the end caps,
The-
just to be clear.
Right, and I'll rephrase. The trimmed ends from both the first and second Titan hulls were maintained at your Everett facility and provided to the Marine Board. Lieutenant Steele, can you call up slide 28, please? Dr. Kramer, I just want to reference this slide, which says rubbing damage, longitudinal rub marks. Does this indicate that fore and aft there was some kind of rubbing damage between the layers of the carbon fiber?
Yeah, so essentially, we're evaluating the features that are on this fracture surface, and the linear features that are aligned with the red arrow are not consistent with the types of fractures that we would typically see. They're more consistent with, excuse me, with fracture faces that are rubbing against one another. Sorry, and that motion creating those features.
So in your experience with fracture analysis at the NTSB, this would not be indicative of a catastrophic failure with no with no pre-movement?
Well, I think, again, that starts to get into the issue of correlating observations with timing,
Okay.
and that starts getting me into analysis.
Understand. Thank you. Lieutenant Steele, can you call up the slide for dive 80, please?
What number is that, sir?
It's slide 38. I'm sorry, actually slide 39 is the strain gauge for response for dive 80. Dr. Kramer, I want to understand the shift that occurred during the loud bang and what that might indicate from a strain gauge perspective. Is this indicating that the strain gauge moved in relation to the hull, or is it that the strain gauge is receiving data differently? Can you just explain what this means to you?
Well, so the strain gauge is physically bonded to the hull, and so unless the so any changes in the strain of the hull are expected to be reflected in the readout of the gauge. And so that's what we're seeing here. I guess maybe I'm not understanding your question.
Does this mean that the hull is now experiencing the strains in a different manner?
So it means that it means that there is a sudden change in both the longitudinal and the hoop strain at this particular location of the hull. And we see this type of response for this is gauge group 4, and we don't see it for other gauge groups, such as group 3. And so there's a change in the strain in the hull that is occurring at this location that is not occurring at other locations.
Is that something that would be problematic if you were monitoring strain gauge data?
Well, without offering my own opinion about what I would do as a engineer, I guess I would just refer back to Mr. Brooks's testimony about his concern about it and other people at Ocean Gate.
Thank you. Oh, and can you confirm where strain gauge 4 is on the hull? Do you remember?
Well, so we do have a document from the Deep Ocean Test Facility that shows the strain gauge layout. But based on Mr. Brooks's testimony, there is a little bit of uncertainty at the moment as to exactly where that gauge is. And so I think at the moment, I'm hoping to get that clarified shortly so that we can be more specific about that.
Yes, sir. Okay,
Yeah.
that remains under investigation then. the exact location?
Yeah, the diagram from the deep ocean test facility does provide a location for it. We just need to confirm whether it changed or not.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fawcett?
Thank you, Dr. Kramer. Will a sound make a movement that's detectable by a acoustic strain gauge? All right, correction on that, on a strain gauge.
Well, so you're talking about in the context of the Titan?
Correct.
Well, so I think that I think if we look at so we have both strain data and we have acoustic emission data, and I think that if you look at those two, you would probably conclude that they're not correlated.
Thank you, sir.
Are there any final questions for Dr. Kramer? Dr. Kramer, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you think would be valuable to the board at this time ahead of your analysis?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Sir, I want to thank you again for the time you've spent on this project and collaboration with the MBI. You are now released as a witness at this formal hearing. Thank you for your testimony and cooperation. If I later determine that this board needs additional information from you, I will contact you through NTSB counsel. If you have any questions about this investigation, you may contact the investigation recorder, Lieutenant Kelly Steele. At this time, we will recess until our next witness, which will start at 10:30.